Hello, Endeavor here. In 1906, the aging American philosopher William James, in his final address to the public, gave a speech at Stanford University on the rising militarism in the years leading up to World War I. The American Civil War had happened a generation prior. While the American people at the time would have shuddered to imagine repeating such a conflict, the memory of that great struggle was deeply revered by the America of the early 20th century. Japan and Germany were rising imperial powers, longing for their time in the sun. Their military strength was growing and their ambitions were set on expansion. Countries like the US or Britain at the time thought of their own military might as purely defensive and that aggression is something which countries like Germany or Japan do. Yet only a few years prior, the American and British publics were captivated by the Spanish-American War and the Boer War respectively, and these wars resulted in major territorial expansion for both these nations. James was a pacifist and a strong critic of militarism, but he recognized war's unique ability to instill civic virtue in men throughout history. While James disdained war himself and wished to see it abolished, he understood that it served a primordial function for man which couldn't simply be done away with. In his 1906 speech, which was turned into an essay in 1910, James proposed a means of maintaining peace, while upholding civic virtue in the absence of war. He termed his proposition the moral equivalent of war. He has a very unique perspective because he combines a utopian pacifism with a very realist understanding of the nature of man. Many socialists opposed to militarism at the time argued that war was the result of capitalism and that it served the interests of the ruling class at the expense of the working class. The solution to militarism put forth by some capitalists was a peace economy, where free trade and economic interconnectedness would make war impossible. James rejected both of these ideas, understanding that the driving force behind war was not economic but spiritual. War is the romance of history. It's the great struggle which determines the course that history takes. Military service is every man's first duty to his nation, and every man wants to belong to a conquering nation. The archetype of the warrior has always been greatly venerated. The warrior is a hero. There is a hardy virtue to the warrior which cannot be matched. While remaining opposed to war, James understood why the warrior archetype is someone we want in society. He also noted that war has an unmatched power to instill a sense of collective civic duty in the citizenry, to get them to commit to serving society as a whole. Benito Mussolini said that war is to man what maternity is to woman. While Mussolini was a militarist and James was a pacifist, I could imagine James would have agreed with this quotation. James argued that if war was to be done away with, some great struggle in which all the virtues of war could be achieved peacefully would be needed, a moral equivalent of war. He advocated for a great struggle against nature. Rather than being conscripted into a military, men would be conscripted into a workforce and embark on the most ambitious of public works campaigns. Men could embrace their warrior spirit through collective manual labor, working on railroads, skyscrapers, mines, and more. James argued this would instill toughness without callousness, create authority without cruelty, and eliminate the high risk of loss of life or limb. He claimed this would give men the same sense of honor associated with war, endear them to women, and make them better fathers and leaders for the future. James gave his moral equivalent of war speech at a time of rising militarism in the Western world. He put forth his utopian vision of peace in an effort to avoid another bloody conflict in which so many lives would be lost. His efforts proved unsuccessful when the First World War broke out in 1914, 4 years after James' death. While we are living in a radically different time from when James gave his speech in the early 20th century, I'd like to apply this idea of a moral equivalent of war being used in the absence of war as a means of getting the population to commit to working towards a collective goal, regardless of whether that goal is just or not. The West has not seen a great struggle since the end of the Second World War, an event which served as its foundational myth for the 75 years which followed. There was the potential for a conflict with the Cold War, but that never materialized, largely due to advances in military technology which made war between nuclear powers almost impossible. With the demise of communism at the end of the Cold War, the liberal egalitarian individualism which the West embraced following the Second World War became the dominant political force throughout the world. However, I now feel that 2020 truly was the end of the post-World War II era. The elites who rule over the Western world are currently attempting to drastically reshape our way of life for a new globalist age. The question is, how do you do that? Especially with a population which has wallowed in consumerism, degeneracy, and nihilism for decades. The answer is you need a new great struggle for them to fight for. James made his speech in the early 20th century as an attempt to avoid war when it was a very real possibility. But today, war between states on the scale of the mid-20th century is not feasible. Now in the early 21st century, in order to get the populace to conform to a new set of civic virtues for a great reset of society, the elites need a moral equivalent of war. Now, I'm sure you all know what this great struggle which I'm referring to is by now. The illness which has been the sinecure of the world for the last 2 years. It's been widely noted that compliance with this agenda has taken on almost a religious fervor in a segment of the population. The same people who are the most ardent supporters of the previously established mores of egalitarianism, or wokeism as it's known today. It's not simply fear of the perceived threat of an illness. Why do they always post on social media when they've taken a medication? Why do they make a point of always being seen wearing a face mask, both online and in the real world? Whenever someone is ill with anything today, why do they always ask, regardless of the symptoms or severity, but is it the illness? And most of all, why do they confront those who don't wear their masks or take their medication with the most vitriolic of hostility? Not out of fear of the illness, but anger that someone dared not to conform. It's because for them, the fight, or rather perceived fight, against this particular illness has been built up as a great struggle. Going back to William James' speech, war, or a moral equivalent of war, is needed to get society to collectively work towards a goal. It's the best way to instill a set of civic virtues in the populace. Now, with the present-day example, we can throw away what James said about a great struggle fostering the masculine warrior spirit. On the contrary, I can't think of anything less masculine than conforming with this new morality. But what it is effective at fostering is a new, twisted set of collective civic virtues for the world the globalist elites want to create. Some shitlibs secretly love this supposed crisis, because it allows them to derive this phony sense of civic virtue from their lives of sitting alone in their apartment watching Netflix and ordering food off of Uber Eats. What are the impacts on the individual from adhering to this agenda? Extreme social isolation for months on end. The erasure of the human face. Previously regular human interactions being approached with severe paranoia. Intense hostility to nonconformity. The intrusion of technology into every aspect of life. Constant obsession with illness and death. Loss of control over one's own medical decisions. And ramifications on one's health which I shudder to imagine. The desired outcome for this new set of supposed civic virtues is dehumanization, isolation, and obedience. Much like how World War II acted as the foundational myth for the era of universalist egalitarian individualism from 1945 to 2020. I believe that the fight against this illness will serve as a new foundational myth for a post-human era, where the individual is a dispensable cog in a technocratic grid which controls every aspect of their life. Once the elites have the technology in place and have conditioned the population to the right degree, they'll switch from this one great struggle to the next. The fight against climate change will serve as a new moral equivalent to war, and a permanent one. The narrative will probably go that the fight against this illness showed us that global problems require global solutions. That the systems we had in place before 2020 aren't fit for a globalized world. That we're all in this together and that we all live on this planet and we must make sacrifices to solve the climate crisis. They won't simply tell you to get in the pod and eat the bugs. They'll create a whole new morality, as was done after World War II, to get you in the pod eating the bugs. Doing so will be declared virtuous. By plugging yourself into the so-called smart city, you'll be doing your part in the global battle against the terrible threat of climate change. Compliance with the new system will be morally equated to fighting to defend your nation in a war in eras past. The same way that cowards or traitors were detested in times of war in the past, climate deniers will be given the same treatment. Eating too much meat or using a wood-burning stove will be treated the same way as not taking your medication or not wearing a mask is today. And if you think the activists who enforce this agenda are insufferable now, just imagine what they'll be like when they've been told that they're saving the planet. Much like how after World War II, history was distorted to fit the new zeitgeist, the same will be done with the history of the era that we're living through now. This so-called crisis will be exaggerated to a ridiculous degree in the history written about it in the future. It will be said that we triumphed in this great struggle due to our trust in science and technology and us coming together as a global community. The deaths will be blown out of proportion and attributed to misinformation and conspiracy theorists, to those who didn't trust the science. And this will be the moral justification for absolute global control over information and all aspects of people's lives. This era will act as the historical basis for the morality of the climate agenda, which will serve as the great struggle in perpetuity. Denying the official historical narrative or denying the threat of climate change will be made akin to denying certain historical narratives about World War II in the near future. Because in order to get people to comply with their new technocratic system of control, they need a moral equivalent to war. And this is how they will achieve it. That is, if this system actually works. So this is how William James' moral equivalent to war is applicable to the agenda of the elites today, but is there a way for us to apply this concept for our own purposes? In the early 20th century, James would have been considered a progressive. His utopian and socialistic, though not Marxist, proposition of a world without war would have put him on the left for his time. But in the present day, his recognition of man's innate admiration of the martial virtues, war's unique ability to foster them, and their positive impact on society, I would argue put him on the right. His moral equivalent to war is a proposition on how to uphold the martial virtues in the absence of war. In the early 20th century, the problem wasn't the lack of these virtues, but the threat of war. Today, our problem isn't the threat of war, but the lack of virtues. While James' proposal of a collective conquest of nature is socialistic, it's also very Faustian. Oswald Spengler wrote that the expanse into endless space was the defining aspect of the Faustian culture of the West over the past millennium. The idea of a great struggle against nature, building railways and skyscrapers and such, bringing prosperity to the nation and instilling men with the warrior spirit, would run into the same problem as the rest of the culture which Spengler wrote about in his book, The Decline of the West. The problem is that eventually the conquest of nature would end. Nature would be conquered and the warrior virtues which conquered it would be lost when the next generation no longer had to endure the hardship which created them. I'd argue that's actually not that far off from what happened over the past century. So for that reason, I do not share William James' utopian pacifist vision for a great struggle against nature as a means to end all war. It would not be able to prevent war, satisfy the warrior spirit, and garner civic virtue for all time. You'd run out of nature to conquer, and doing so would make it unnecessary for others to continue to do so in the future, thus losing the spiritual reward derived from the struggle. But going back to my point from earlier, the problem that we have is not the threat of war, but lack of martial virtues. I do agree on the value of the martial virtues and that they can only come from a great struggle. However, despite the chaos of our time, I don't think that war is probable or at all desirable. We're living in a radically different world from a century ago. So in order to regain the martial virtues, we need our own moral equivalent of war. And I think that an opportunity for this might be coming our way soon. The material overabundance of the modern world has made us weak and degenerate. But soon, there's a chance that many of us, such as those who don't comply with the mandates of the new biomedical tyranny, will be locked out of this system and shut off from its excesses, meaning we'll need to build something new outside the system. The causes which the system is building up as a great struggle to get the populace to comply, this illness or climate change, they aren't great and they aren't real struggles. They've simply been manufactured as narratives to convince the populace that this post-human globalist technocracy is necessary. And what is being declared virtuous under this new morality? These aren't virtues, they're anti-virtues. Rather than fostering the warrior virtues which great struggles throughout history have, these phony struggles foster weakness. It's also fake and gay. But the struggle against this system, that can be very real. Building new communities, businesses, infrastructure, who knows what. What I think will happen will be similar to what happened with deplatforming in alt tech. Like how they banned us from all the mainstream social media platforms, so we started using alt tech. They will set up restrictions against us, but we'll find ways around them. They will shut down our methods of subverting the system, but then we'll find new ones. Living without the excesses of modernity, which we've become so over-reliant on, and building something new for ourselves, that can be our great struggle. A new struggle against nature and a tyrannical system. That's something which has the potential to restore hardy masculine virtues and give us a sense of duty towards our collective good. Only time will tell what that will look like. It could be that we need to set up our own businesses and work for each other, or it could mean that we need to retreat into the wilderness and grow our own potatoes. But either way, I won't comply with the new normal, but I don't want to go back to the nihilistic, atomized consumerism of 2019 either. Instead, I'm looking forward to our opportunity to build something different. One of the positives of what's happening now is that people are being presented with a binary choice. You can't just LARP on the internet anymore. You either do what the system wants you to, or you don't. And if you choose not to comply, your only other option is to band together with other non-compliers and create something viable outside the system. This has the potential to create genuine solidarity, which can be the bedrock of new communities. And you'll have real, physical, hardy tasks which you can solve together. And that has the potential to restore the masculine virtues which we've long since lost. We might lose some of the comforts of modernity which we've grown up so accustomed to, but we have the opportunity to regain something much more valuable. One thing that James was right about is that war is the romance of history. I remember about a decade ago, before I was even politically conscious, my interest in all of these issues started with an interest in history. And naturally, I started by learning about the wars. Reading about the American Civil War or World War I. That's what started me on my path to my worldview today. I remember back then, I believed that history had ended and that we would just have consumerism forever, and I found that depressing. I lamented not having a great struggle of our own. And I'll say again, I don't predict nor desire war in the near future, but I think now we will in fact have a great struggle of our own, one which could engender a sense of civic duty toward one another and foster in us the warrior virtues. And that's something to be grateful for. We may never be great warriors like the men of old, but maybe we finally have an opportunity to find our own moral equivalent of war. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, please follow me on Odysee as well, as I'm not likely to last on YouTube for very much longer. You can follow me on Telegram, and if you'd like to support my work with a donation, you can do that too. All links are in the description. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.